Venri Chapter 31. Timeline. Priority, Horizon. Shepard. She hadn't lost anybody. She was amazed she hadn't lost anybody. Even Miranda had made it. Moram had that third-person sense of worry. Why would Miranda go in alone and do something like that without backup? Because of her sister. Oh, right. Yeah, I do that. I'm crazy. Garrus, I'm sorry I'm crazy. They need me crazy. Even you need me crazy if we're gonna get through this. So no last-minute doubts of my methods or madness. It's too late. Timeline. Priority, Cerberus headquarters. Garrus. After a front-loaded firefight in the landing bay of the Cerberus base, they had an Atlas come at them. He'd been busy trying to keep Edie from getting pinned down. Moram was getting good at depopulating an Atlas. Shakarian, I made you a promise. This one's yours. Edie and Moram covered him as he started to laugh, then sprinted over and climbed in. His bondmate loved him. Very much. He'd watched her make things disappear in falling pink and blue explosions with guarded jealousy for long enough. He let out a whoop and then stomped around the landing bay until long after everyone was dead. It was particularly satisfying stepping on a phantom, though he couldn't find the controls to jump up and down. He was hoping for more. There'd been lots of yelling coming from his mouth that didn't necessarily have words involved. After he started to slow down and was feeling mournful, Moram looked up at him. You want to stay here? Guard the rear flank? I mean, really, rear. You could shoot at the guys that are already dead. Make them explode. He stomped around in a tight circle. Come on, just one more minute. I'm sure there are more of them coming this way. Edie told him. No, I'm certain there are no more squads in proximity. Garrus scowled. Will it fit down the hole? Nope. Sorry. Ladder. I'm not coming down until you promise to buy me one of these. Later, after the Reapers are dead, I can be reasonable. Moram grinned. That's a little unrealistic. The reasonable thing. Sure, we can get you an Atlas. We can get two. Deathmatch Atlas paintball. He grinned and climbed down. I love you so much. Have I mentioned that? She shrugged and jumped down the ladder. It's because I get you toys. You are high maintenance. He happily agreed. I'm worth it, though. Timeline. Priority, Earth. How to spend possibly the last night of his life with his bondmate. They'd done this a few times before. She'd been controlled and reserved, kind and contained. He understood why. He'd deferred to her style, helping her maintain equilibrium through lightness and humor. Every moment with her was and had been special. What they really needed was the time and the familiarity and the luxury of taking each other for granted, knowing they'd be there tomorrow. He imagined saying that to her. Hey, how about we just ignore each other and kind of smile at each other while reading our data pads, convinced we have all the time in the world? Maybe touch hands as we move around the cabin doing other things? But then he thought, well, then sex. Of course sex, because that was what they did every day. That's what he wanted. He knew her steady patterns of work, the draw of her brow and the twist of her lip as she paused what she was doing to describe something funny or stupid. The light in her eyes when she thought something was ridiculously cool and she wanted to tell him. He wanted that. More of that. More of her being able to concentrate, to laugh, to stand still without drifting into impenetrable calculation. He knew she liked ice cream. Ice cream was weird and tricky stuff, and while birthed on the Citadel, he'd gone to a place specializing in it and taken some advice. They couldn't make something for him and pack it up. It had to be put together on the spot. He had a container of vanilla ice cream in a temperature-controlled environment. Syrup. That word he knew, but it wasn't maple, it was chocolate. And whipped cream in a canister. There was a jar of cherries. That's what he'd seen her order and enjoy once before. He hoped it would be a pleasure and that she wouldn't dub it a death sundae. He imagined her thinking, "Excellent, I sacrifice my life and as a reward, I get ice cream." It was a small thing, but she'd still eat it. She wasn't crazy. Well, not that kind of crazy. It was metaphoric in the melting, sweet way she had described it. Can't be preserved, won't last, must be enjoyed in the moment. He was afraid a larger gesture would break her composure. She knew how much it meant, how much he loved her, what he was willing to do for her. When he got to their cabin, she was working, curled up on the couch. She turned to look at him, and then her eyes trailed to the packages in his hands. She raised a brow, and he opened them to show her. A bottle of alcohol for him is part of a tradition and the makings of a Sunday. Her face lit up, and he was assured he'd made the right choice. She jumped up, lunged at him, and kissed him fiercely, then grabbed the bags out of his hand and brought them over to the table. "Ice cream!" She was happy. That meant he was happy. She pulled out all the bits, and he was about to get a bowl and put something together for her, but she pulled the top off the container and dug in. "There's theoretically a way you're supposed to do that. I learned and everything." She grinned at him. "So I ruined it?" He smiled at her. "Not if you like it." She nodded enthusiastically. "I like it." She grabbed a bottle of whiskey and started pouring everything directly into the container. Whiskey, sauce, cherries. She dispensed some of the whipped cream into her mouth and sat back. "I wish you could taste this. Thank you." She ate the fairly nasty-looking slurry with what looked like joy. He sat down beside her and said, "You're welcome." He thought, "I wish I could taste it too. I wish you could taste all the things I love to eat." It was even more metaphoric than he'd imagined. The ice cream light, the sauce dark, blending together with alcohol and cherry juice like blood thrown in and stirred around. So, not a death Sunday, an our life together Sunday. She ate the whole damn thing, and he was gratified and amused at the sounds and praise coming from her mouth after ice cream went in. She turned to him and glided a fingertip along his mandible, tracing the shape. "While I'm wishing, we've done so much together, and there's still so much we could do together. And I want to do it all again. Maybe not the rocket to the face or the dying, but I want to hold your hand with the weird number of fingers. I want to watch you sleep. I want to wake up next to you thousands of times, every day, forever. I want to hear you laugh, and I want..." After her voice slurred with tears, he echoed her words. "I want." It's behind every breath. I can't say I love you enough. It builds up, this need to tell you, the need to show you, regret for all those missed opportunities and time lost. I have enough to last forever. I just don't have forever. Where would all this love go if... He decided they both knew this. They both felt this, and maybe he could take her for granted, allow her to not have to spill how much she loved him in words. Where would this all go? Love was a separate entity, deserving of its own rules and choices and independent life. He pulled her into his lap, spread his thumbs along her cheekbone, and said, "It won't go anywhere. It will always be truth." He kissed her, and her lips were cold from the ice cream. The odd and bitter taste registered but ignored in favor of the growing warmth and familiar addiction of his Venri's mouth under his. In defiance of the potential loss of time together, he moved slowly, seeking the familiar pleasures of her. One hand tangled in her hair, and another hand slid along her spine. He countered the sense that it might be the last time he did something by deliberately touching her slowly, circling back and doing it again, unwilling to let a patch of skin go by unappreciated as many times as he could. He traced the columns of her fingers with his hands and pressed caresses to her palms and wrists. She gave him a familiar signal, squeezing two of her fingers along the sides of one of his until he extended a talon. She used that to slowly slice off their clothing, moving only enough to free herself and him from the shreds. She kissed at his exposed skin, offering her own to him. She had adopted his pace, and they touched and overtouched each other, fingers and minds memorizing the feel and the curve, the bunching of muscles and the pace of breathing. Her fingertips found the edges of plate, and her palms brushed over the expanse of them. His hands moved along her smooth and bent limbs to her hips, then thighs, knees, and calves, stopping to grip at her ankles and moving back up. He leaned back and shifted, his head resting on the arm of the couch, his fringe over the back. He brought his feet up, bent his knees, and pushed her shoulders back, so she was leaning against his thighs. He didn't have to tell her how beautiful she was, how she embodied desire for him. His hand smoothed over her thighs, and she leaned back, closed her eyes, and lifted her breasts in her palms. He could see all of her this way, watch the sweat form and trail. He wanted to watch her, drink in the color of her hair, her marks, and her skin, watch her stomach muscles and thighs clench and relax. He wanted to dedicate his senses to her. He could watch her while she had her eyes closed, and that brought out his possessive instincts, and she knew it, knew him. She arched her back against his thighs, a patient invitation to his more voyeuristic desire to watch her body, feeding the hunter, savoring opportunities. His talons lazily circled her knees, careful to not tickle, but to lightly scratch along her skin. He scratched lines up and down her thighs, drawing sighs from her. He wanted to see the hunger in her, see that she felt as he did, to build up desire in her until it spoke to him through her whimpers, her moans, and the twisting of her body. He used one hand to grip her hip and pull her toward him, tracing her skin with his fingers, watching her bite her lip and moan in anticipation. Her hands stilled on her breasts and then dug deeper into the skin there, leaving curved shadows in the flesh around her fingers. His hand smoothed over her thighs, and she leaned back, closed her eyes, and lifted her breasts in her palms. His hand moved from her hip to the inside of her thigh, gliding along her skin. His other hand moved to slide a finger into her slick heat, the scent and sight of her tearing through his observer stance, building predatory hunger. She lifted her body with her thighs, pressed harder back against his legs. One of her hands came down to grip his hand on her thigh, twining her fingers with his. His thumb sought her clit, and she moved her hips in tandem with his hand. He had to be careful to not grip her fingers so hard they broke, and the delicate shift of her clit under his thumb was near ephemeral. Too small to cause this shuddering, shaking, clenching around him. He didn't tease her or play with her, but he did step her forward and back, a path of sensation moving in switchbacks, back, and then higher. He'd rock her closer and then a little further away, to pause, to begin again. This was driving the intensity of her pulsing and whimpering until she was tense and trembling, and begging words began to slip from her mouth. Please. And his name, and gasps, breathy feathers of words. It brought her to her uniquely human release, her head bent and lip-bitten, cords of her neck standing out as he watched. She pinched her nipple hard between the edges of two fingers in the hand that was cupping her breast, the nails of her other hand digging into the back of his hand. He withdrew his hand to rest on her thighs, watching her shudder and falling down aftershocks of pleasure. His eyes took in the contrast of his plate against her skin, hide and hard against the expanse of soft and delicate, faint red lines fading on her breast, her thigh marked by his hand and hers. He watched her shift and relax, watched and felt her breathing slow down and her hips settle onto his legs and abdomen. He thought that given time together, all the time they wanted, he would still never take her for granted, would always have to temper his constant focus on her with a forced rhythm of casual necessity, stopping to do other things only reluctantly. Only her will had kept him from taking her away from everything else but him. He was voracious for those possible moments after, alone together, allowing him to pursue the flash of her hair and the lilt of her voice when he wanted to, which was always. Over time, he'd seen her transform from the practiced shell of Shepard to the woman under all her defenses and constructions. The idea of her belonging entirely to him and not to a cause beat in both their hearts. Her eyes opened and he drank her in, voyeuristic observation done, and wanting to be lost in her kindling green fire. He wanted too much at once, as always, wanted to hide her behind his back, stroke her hair, break her will, and bend her body. She smiled in a way that made him feel she understood exactly what he wanted, and would give all of them to him, none forgotten or overlooked, if only she could. She leaned forward and her hair fell in a curtain around their faces as she braced one hand on his chest and kissed him, then moving away to rub her nose, her cheek, over the planes of his face, and back to his mouth. Her other hand stroked at the seam of him until he opened to her, gasping against her mouth as her hand delved inside to stroke, his cock twisting toward her, seeking the broad strokes of her palm and grasp of her fingers. Too many fingers. Weird number of fingers. She shifted back, both of her hands and her mouth now on his cock, and he was unraveling. One hand of his flexed hard on the floor, scraping his talons into the unyielding surface to feel the resistance, and the other hand with talons itching to spring free, but sheathed, tangled in her hair. Through contact with any part of her, his cock caused degrees of reverie that she'd discovered was how she could make him the most crazy, with her hands and her mouth pulling from him. He couldn't sheath himself fully in her mouth and stay for long because she couldn't breathe. Every instinct of his body wanted to drive deeper into her, and that conflict made him shake. Her fingers and her tongue and her hair falling around the sides of him were bright, dizzying, and impossible. Or so he felt. She could drive him to snarling, growling, animal urge to sheath himself fully in his taunting bondmeat, pulling eons of Turian mating instinct from his spine and into his hands. Withdrawal from her mouth made him have to fight for control he was rapidly losing. She could make him pass out this way, losing the battle between control and unconsciousness, restraining himself from forcing his cock deep into her throat. He bucked his hips involuntarily, and she took him deeper, and the moan in her throat vibrated around him. And then she released him and took him back in just as deeply. If he did what he wanted, he'd end up killing her through asphyxiation or deep puncture wounds. Instead, he pulled her off him with a snarl, rolled her onto the floor, positioning her with the speed and strength that made her gasp. She spun a little on the floor until he stopped her with a growl. He took a long moment to enjoy seeing her sprawled on her back, surprise and lust on her face. With a snarl of satisfaction, he drove his cock into her mouth at his pace, allowing her to breathe, but drawing squeaks and moans and spirits. Yes. He shoved her thighs apart and drove his tongue into her, driving at the same pace his cock was slamming in and out of her mouth, hitting the back of her throat and withdrawing. Determined to make her as crazy as she made him, he took long, vengeful strokes, ravaging her mouth, her lips stretched tight around him. He tongue-fucked her, withdrew to bite at her thigh and lick at her, and then started over. Her body was heaving and frantic, hungry welcome of his invasions, and the delicate trembles began in her thighs, rhythmic moans around his cock. He teased her, drew back, and almost laughed at the indignant protest stifled in her mouth with a hard thrust. He held her thighs open wider with his hands, digging in talons and moving his tongue insistently over her clit until she moaned for him, shuddered for him, broke apart and whimpered and clutched at him. He withdrew from her panting mouth, lifted her from the floor, put her limp and clinging body down on the bed. It took a long moment to memorize the hard lines of her breathing, the raising of her arms to invite him back down into her embrace, not willing to be parted. He followed her down, his cock sliding into her still pulsing body with a delicious whimper he took into his mouth. He kissed her and let his hands roam over her while she lay beneath him in straining welcome. He stroked back her sweat-strung hair, pressed her mouth to his throat until she bit at him, her tongue and teeth drawing more sound from him. He bit his tongue and kissed her, remembering his senses, his dedication. He saw her. He touched her. He tasted her. He heard her. He breathed in the scent of them together. He loved her. During the assault on London, Garrus had commented, "Good thing there are no proximity mines here." Remember that time when she didn't know what they were and she stepped on every single one of them? She was too busy nearly getting blown up to listen to us when we asked her to look for the glowing red triangle thingies. To put it in her language. I had shields. Hush, you two. Grown-ups are fighting. And winning. That's what I'm saying. We're winning now, but if Reapers used mines like the Geth did, we'd all be doomed. Shepard. Searing pain. Searing pain in the dark. Searing pain in the dark and cold. Searing pain in the dark and cold and trying to move. Searing pain in the dark and cold and trying to move and trying to breathe. Searing pain in the dark and cold and trying to move and trying to breathe and panic. Breathe. Pain. Darkness. Cracked blood on her lips. Pain in her ribs. Breathing deeply was impossible, and it was what had woken her, trying to draw in breath. She screamed, the sound dry and weak. Her thigh was flaring with pain, and when her hand went to her pinned right leg through the shattered armor, her skin was numb and cold. She tried to move wreckage off herself, but she didn't have enough strength. How much time had passed? She tried to look at her Omni-tool, but it was dark. After a few futile tries, she sank back, exhaustion making her gasp for shallow breaths. She focused on dispersing panic to reveal underlying sense as her mind came back to her. She hadn't done this before, but she'd done things like this before. She'd made her choice. Destroy the Reapers. She'd expected to be dead. Maybe she still would be. The Crucible will not discriminate. All synthetics will be targeted. Even you are part synthetic. She coughed the familiar taste of blood and started to push against the wreckage. No more synthetics. No more upgrades. They now only added weight to her body. She still had some biochemical upgrades that were inherent and not cybernetic, and maybe they had saved her life. She could still heal. She still had her mind. She still had discipline. No more panic. She promised herself that if she got through this, she'd spend a day screaming. At least a day. Okay, deal. Her hand moved to under her armor. Her locket was still there. She opened it and breathed in, holding it in a shaking hand pressed against her forehead. Her job was done, and all that was left was this. Panic of a new kind gripped her, and she fought it back. Where was Garrus? She was alive? She had no idea if anybody else was. Anywhere. She wanted to see the surface of Earth from some vantage point. Something without fire, without Reaper shapes. She promised herself that. Shelve what you don't know. Work with what you do know. Mechanics, and not synthetics. She would have to do it with leverage. Her armor was charred and dead weight. She stripped it off and shoved the chest piece between her leg and the panel on top of it and rocked it slowly. It hurt like being lit on fire, and she could tell she would lose more blood soon if she didn't do something to prevent it. She dry heaved from the pain. The upside to not having any food? The fabric of her shirt was resistant to her weak and scrabbling hands, and she had to rest for more long minutes, in danger of crashing into the black of unconsciousness. She drew in a sharp breath in order to invoke a scream and wakefulness. Adrenaline and lightheadedness made her hands shake harder. She sliced the edge of her shirt on something jagged. That wasn't hard to find, at least. She carefully and painfully removed the charred armor off of and out of her leg, tying a tourniquet above her knee. Her knee was a mess. She was grateful and terrified that it didn't hurt below her thigh. She still had a water pouch and a little Metagel, and she treated the biggest gashes she had. Her right thigh was the worst, and the leg was useless. There was nothing she could do for the pain or the internal injuries. At least with the tourniquet, maybe she wouldn't bleed out. No time to do anything but think about mechanics. Her weapons were gone. Her armor was gone. Her Omni-tool was gone. Her helmet was gone. She needed air first. She had oxygen for now, but this ruined place wouldn't support life. Mechanics. Focus. Garrus, limping, bleeding, as she left him and wouldn't look back. Mechanics. Focus. You're alive, and you need to stay that way. You made a promise to him. You're going to operate under the impression that he is alive and angry at you, because that would motivate you most. She leveraged all the wreckage off herself after long, crushingly painful and shaking effort. She was in a field of jagged char and dark, a contained space in a station above Earth's atmosphere. Doors were synthetic, at least electronic. She needed to find a mechanical door. She needed to find any door. Walking was not a possibility. She was going to have to go down from wherever she was. The debris field was on a severe tilt. Navigation was treacherous amid the shifting flotsam and jetsam of whatever the hell she had just done. She could imagine getting through this and trying to explain to someone what she'd done. Honestly, I haven't got a fucking clue. Someone who was able to watch, let me know. Heroic. She spat out blood and considered. Biotics. Biotics would help, but would also sap her fast. She'd had to eat enough for 2 people just to keep up with the burn on her metabolism. She tried a biotic flare on her hand. She saw smoke and lightning. Only a little flickering blue, back to the level of before she'd had an implant. Not an available resource. What she had left was residual Ezo in her system and Leviathan influence. It was still useful as light, flickering and swarming. She picked her way over the field of broken and lost purpose. She saw a hatch and worked her way toward it. Loss of power might mean loss of locking mechanism. She didn't have the hydration to spare in order to cry, and she didn't have the hope to pray to the spirits. 20 feet left. Her tourniquet snagged on the corner of a sharp beam, and she had to backtrack painfully to free it, the dead weight of her leg fueling despair. She lost ground. 25 feet. Mechanics. Focus. She climbed over a steep, fallen partition and slid down the other side, slamming hard into the wall near the hatch. 5 feet. And coughing some more fresh blood, a rib slammed hard and sharp into her side. Just get to the hatch, and you can rest. You can't rest. If you rest, you die. I'd really like to die right about now. Just get to the hatch. 3 feet. It might as well be the moon. 2 feet. Don't think about anything other than the will it takes to move your screaming muscles forward. Do it. She reached the hatch's hinges and stopped, resting because she couldn't do anything else. If you open that, you might be sucked into space. Would that be so bad right now? I've done it before. Open it. You have no other option. If you die, you might die fast. Think on the bright side. Garrus. He woke in the semi-dark, and his first thought was to look for Morim. A few moments brought the knowledge that he wasn't in their cabin, and the smell was that of the med bay. His hands still reached to the bed at his sides, trying to locate her body out of hope and not logic. Then it hit him. She'd left him. She'd left him. Spiked and piercing pain shot through him, and he let out an involuntary whimper of grief and helplessness. His eyes took in the room in the dim light. The ship was still. Entirely still. No hum or thrum of the Normandy systems. Tally was lying still one bed over. He saw Karen and saw the apprehension on her face before her more stoic medical persona slipped down over her features. Karen said, "Garrus," and tapped the side of her head, behind her ear. "What the hell happened, Karen?" She shook her head and tapped again, and when she spoke, he understood by not understanding a damn thing she said. Their translators were out. He said, "Shepard." She shrugged helplessly, her eyes watering. He growled in deep frustration, and Karen said, "Liara." Did she want Liara to break the news to him? Wait. Back up. Liara might be the only one that could communicate right now. Taking in the dark and the translators, he moved to activate his Omni tool as Karen watched him catch up. Nothing. He'd learned only a little English, but he imagined Karen thought that at this moment he was going to destroy what remained of her medbay, if not her, personally. Not a bad guess, based on his current state. He realized he was reverberating with a feral growl, a menacing subharmonics, and he stopped with effort. He closed his eyes, took deep, slow breaths, and made a grab at years of battle discipline and focus under fear. Gained a foothold. He nodded tightly and said, "Liara." "Yes." He moved to get off the medbay bed, but Karen shook her head and crossed the room to push him back down. The amount of pain clamoring from his body and the instability of his legs convinced him to sit and wait. He still had all his limbs, he could see them. They hurt a lot. Pressure bandages covered his form, some stained with seeping and fresh blue. He remembered the sheeting impact of shrapnel on top of bullet wounds. Yeah, that would do it. Karen had done the best she could do with no technology to help her. Garrus acquiesced and sat back, nodded to Karen, and said, "Liara." "Yes." Karen left. His eyes drifted to Tally. Without his visor, without any monitors, he could only gauge her by the fact that she was still breathing. He breathed with her, matched her pace to keep from giving in and tearing apart the medbay, useless piece by useless piece. His hand moved to the back of his head and sought the kinral spacers and the slick texture of the color under his fringe. Her blood. His bone. I will find out what happened. I will find you, Venri. He made those solemn promises and then refrained from promising to kill her himself when he met her. When, not if. When. She'd left him. Liara entered the medbay alone and walked to him, her face poised. Hard won, that poise. She walked to Garrus and gave him a light embrace, avoiding his injuries. She put her hand to his temple and showed him what she had seen, what she knew and did not know. He saw her at Joker's shoulder, a swelling wave of red energy bearing down on them, the order to go from Hackett's mouth by Liara's urging. He shuddered violently. He would have ordered them to go directly back to the Citadel. Morim was in that wave. Liara showed him images of himself. He and Tally had been brought on at Morim's evacuation order. After the paralysis and shock of Morim's final order and goodbye had left him, he'd shaken off assistance and tried to limp to the shuttle, determined to go back. He had collapsed 3/4 of the way there. Liara had gone with his unconscious form back to the medbay, then to the CIC. His eyes closed and he wrenched breath from his lungs. He hadn't been there for her. The Normandy hadn't been there for her. Spirits damn them all. Liara waited for him to absorb this, waited for his next question as he took in the answers. He tried to stay calm, Liara's own guilt, doubt, and horror flickering like dark smoke at the edges of the images and answers. Liara showed him the ultimate crash landing site of the Normandy, where they were now. Liara smiled weakly, her tears cresting in her eyes as she showed him that she'd fed Morim's fish and hamster every day, once they got access to her cabin through the ducts. Garrus pulled Liara into an embrace, apologizing and resting his crest on her shoulder. They both stood in communion of not being enough, trying to reassure each other that they had done their best, and knowing that their best had been insufficient. She cried, and he tried to clear his mind. She offered to dull his pain, but he refused. She understood and didn't push. It's what he had of Morim right now, and he didn't want it taken from him. She turned to issues of the crew. No deaths, minor injuries. Tally was fighting an infection from suit breaches, and she had some injuries, but fortunately, recovery only involved antibiotics and time. There were no tech issues other than Tally's suit being limited in its ability to help her. They'd had to rig an alternate battery source for her suit. Fortunately, Quarians had backups upon redundant systems, and the basics of atmosphere circulation were mechanical, stable, and functional. Karen had assured Liara that Tally would recover. Although bewildered herself about what had happened, red energy not being self-explanatory in any way, Liara conveyed that Adams, Gabby, and Ken had compared the damage to an electromagnetic pulse. All active programs and functions wiped out, electronics shut down. The Normandy was comparable to Morim's mind after contact with Leviathan. Starting pathways lost, but theoretically the information was still there, just encrypted or misplaced. Mechanics worked, anything relying on software did not. They'd managed to isolate and activate several mechanical systems and a few minor technical systems. Ship-wide communication was hopefully only a few days away, but there was still the problem of translation. Liara was the only translator. The crew being nearly entirely human meant that work was proceeding. The good news was that systems that had been dormant during the blast would start up. Spare omnitools and translators that hadn't been active during the blast had been able to be activated. There was no networking yet, but they had the basics of calculation and databases and access to engineering specs, enough to know where to start. Or so the engineering team had assured her. James was in charge, making his rounds of the ship, through ducts if necessary. They were rigging a mechanical solution for the elevator, but for now didn't use it. The humans could all communicate, and Engineer Adams had set up some radios, though they didn't work as well as they might, the composition of the ship itself interfering. Food and water were thankfully in plentiful supply. Morim had stocked up massively in the build-up to the push to Earth. They had enough food for a long time, Levo and Dextro. He felt her hesitation at the concept of time and her use of the word long, and he had learned enough from her apprehension to not push. She didn't know, and didn't want to guess. Liara had tentative hope that ship functions would be restored. Garrus was needed to add his mind to the rebuilding of technical systems. Edie was unresponsive. All her functions had to be isolated and restarted individually. Edie had heavy encryption on ship systems, but Joker knew some bypasses because she'd confided in him. Joker knew what to work around, and some back doors, and where the traps were laid. Edie had planned for the possibility that she might be hijacked by a Cerberus process, but she hadn't wanted to harm or alarm her crew. Edie was the map to the Normandy, and without her, they were lost. until they stumbled across landmarks by luck or guile beyond what Joker had given them as a starting point. Edie's platform was sitting in the co-pilot's chair, and Joker had declared he wouldn't allow her to be moved. Nobody had considered it in the first place. Garrus asked Liara, "What about the Reapers?" Liara assured him they had encountered no hostile forces. It appeared they hadn't been pursued in any way, and there were no local inhabitants or wildlife causing concern. Oxygen was plentiful, and the ship's vents were left open to compensate for a lack of atmospheric control. Joker had said that the course correction to crash here was the last directive Edie gave, and it had saved all of their lives. Otherwise, they'd be adrift in space, a long, cold death sentence. Garrus had the resurgent thought that they should be on the Citadel, finding Morin. Then we might have died in the blast. We can't go back, but we can go forward. What can I do to help?